Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Bruce D. Perry, Principal of the Neurosequential Network and Professor at the School of Allied Health, Human Services and Sport at La Trobe University, Australia. With over 3 decades of dedicated work in children's mental health and neuroscience, Dr. Perry has profoundly influenced clinical practices, programs, and policies worldwide, focusing on the impact of trauma, abuse, and neglect on the developing brain. Renowned for his pioneering research, Dr. Perry co-authored the best-selling book The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog and Born for Love with American reporter Maya Salvitz. His latest collaboration with Oprah Winfrey, What Happened to You? Conversation on Trauma, Resilience and Healing has been translated into 26 languages and remained on the New York Times bestseller list for over 100 weeks. Dr. Perry's academic journey includes significant roles at the University of Chicago School of Medicine, Baylor College of Medicine, and Northwestern University. His groundbreaking work spans both basic neuroscience, examining the effect of prenatal drug exposure, and trauma and clinical research, exposing how adverse childhood experiences shape brain biology and health. He is the creator of the neurosequential model, an innovative approach that integrates developmental neuroscience into clinical practice, education, caregiving, and sport. This model is implemented in organizations across the globe, impacting millions. Dr. Perry's extensive experience as a clinician and researcher working with traumatized children has made him a trusted advisor for numerous community and governmental agencies in the aftermath of major incidents involving youth trauma. Beyond academia, Dr. Perry has provided expert consultation following major crises, including the Waco siege, Oklahoma City bombing, and Sandy Hook school shootings. His extensive publication record includes over 500 scholarly articles, and he is the recipient of numerous accolades, including NAMI Scientific Research Award and the Cole Education Prize. Dr. Perry's expertise has been featured widely in media outlets such as 60 Minutes, CNN, and the Oprah Winfrey Show, and is in acclaimed documentaries and print media, including the New York Times and Rolling Stone. He holds both MD and PhD degrees from Northwestern University and completed his psychiatry residency at Yale University. In this episode, Dr. Bruce D. Perry will provide profound insights from his acclaimed book, What Happened to You? Conversation on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. Dr. Bruce D. Perry, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Well, thank you very much. I always think my introduction is a little bit too long sometimes, but it's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually interested to talk with you about the relevance of some of our work for corporate environments. And, it's an area where we are just beginning to learn more and more. We're starting to spend more time with people who are in the business world. And some of the things, we're learning a lot. And I think that some of the things that we do are helpful to folks in the corporate world. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about this.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Dr. Perry, you and Oprah have co-authored a timely and essential book, especially relevant in today's digital age. Could you share the journey of collaborating with Oprah as a co-author?
Yeah, it's interesting that I have known Oprah for well over 30 years. And when I first met her, I lived in Chicago and she lived in Chicago. And she was famous, but she was not as famous then as she is now. And I was a very young faculty member at the University of Chicago at that time. And one of her friends, one of her from her social group, was on the board of an organization that I was doing some work at. And when yeah, and your listeners may know this, but when she was younger, she was actually sexually abused, and she had not really talked about it publicly. But at some point when she was doing her show, she decided that she wanted to share that with everybody, because she thought it was important to talk about it and get it out in the open. And she decided that she wanted to really try to change those things in our society, try to address abuse of children. And he mentioned to her that you got to meet this young guy at the University of Chicago. He's doing this really interesting work. And so that's how we met. And from that point forward, we've had lots of conversations and worked together on a couple of different things. And just our, we she got to know what I was doing. Um, I think I was on her show like 3 times or maybe 4 times, and it just kind of grew naturally. And one of the big areas where we worked together was that she started a school in South Africa for young women, and they had some troubles at that school, and then she asked me to help with those, and I did. And so she knew a lot about the evolution of my work. And when she quit doing her show, she was a special correspondent for 60 Minutes and was doing a show on a program in Milwaukee, which is a town where was kind of a hometown for her. She had a couple of different places where she lived when she was growing up. And the program that she was featuring said, "Oh yeah, we use the model of, Dr. Perry." And she said, "What? Wait, Dr. Bruce? I know Dr. Bruce." So she called me up and asked me if I would be on 60 Minutes with her about this topic. And I said, "All right." So I went up to Milwaukee and we filmed a little bit. And then we were having lunch afterwards. And one of the things that we had seen was there was a particular individual who'd been given all kinds of supports and services and help, and he still was struggling and acting out and not doing well in school. And she said, "What's wrong with that kid?" And I said, "Well, the question really isn't what's wrong with him. It's like what happened to him such that he couldn't take advantage of all these opportunities that were being offered for him." And then it just like she said it was like a sort of an epiphany moment where she realized, oh, that her whole frame of reference about that person changed. And then later on, she said it changed the way she looked at a lot of different things. Anyway, so when the 60 Minutes piece aired, her publisher was watching it and called her up and said, "Hey, do you think Bruce Perry would write a book for us?" And so Oprah called me and I said, "Oprah, I already wrote a book and nobody's reading it." So they don't want to read, they don't want to hear from me. People would be interested in what you have to say about this. So maybe you should write the book. She said, "I don't want to write a book." And I said, "I don't want to write a book either." And so at some point we said, "Well, maybe we should just let's write a book together. We'll just we talk about this all the time. Why don't we just record a bunch of these conversations and then turn that into a book?" And so that's what we decided to do. I went to her uh, home in Hawaii and we spent 3 days recording conversations on her porch about all kinds of things. And then we took the transcripts. I took the transcripts and working with somebody on her team, sort of turned them into text, which was embarrassing because Deepak, I'm sure you've probably seen text of sort of the spoken conversations, and you realize, wow, this is really, it looks incoherent. I mean, there's a lot of incomplete sentences and people talking over each other. Anyway, it was a mess, but we cleaned it up and turned it into the book. So that's how that happened.
Yeah. Dr. Perry, can you explain the fundamental shift in understanding trauma that comes from asking what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you?
Yeah, I think this one of the things I think that is important for everybody when they're trying to understand any situation. Whether it's you're trying to understand, let's say, the conflict in the Middle East, you're trying to understand why your grandpa acts that way to grandma. If you're trying to understand why you find certain things appealing and other things not appealing, why do I like sports and not music? The way to understand that is to look at the history of the person. You just can't understand the current situation if you don't understand how people got to that point. And once you sort of look back and go, oh, I get it. This is what happened. And then this happened. And then this happened. And so it helps you really understand why either a person or a group of people or certain circumstances exist the way they do. Now, in the corporate world, for example, this is really important. If you understand sort of marketing trends and if you understand the evolution of a product and how it was introduced, you're going to have a much better understanding of what to do with that right now. And, if you look, for example, at the story of Kodak, the camera company, they were very uh, insightful in sort of looking at the evolution of photography. And then at some point, they sort of lost it when they minimized the power of digital photography. And this, I think, is a big part of any corporate environment is appreciating the history of your organization, understanding the history of your field, and then trying to make accurate projections by looking at the trend lines. Where's this going? Are people still wearing this kind of clothing? Are people still seeking this kind of product? Or should we pivot and move towards something else? And I think if you just look at the current analytics, right? Like the data that comes into your office from the last quarter, you don't know whether that trend is going up or going down or going sideways. And so the whole thing that we've tried to help people appreciate is that, listen, the present moment is well informed by understanding the past. And so that's kind of what we've tried to get people to do. Instead of getting mad at something, this is a real big issue, for example, in school. When a child struggles and is getting into lots of fights and arguments, and we can say, oh, you are a fighter, you don't pay attention, you're a naughty kid. We can say your behavior right now is all these things. But if we understand that, oh, this is a kid whose dad was deployed, has got a single mom with siblings, who's overwhelmed, he didn't have breakfast all week this week because, mom was working the late shift and didn't get home. And he had to get up and get all of his siblings ready for school. And by the time he got to school, he was exhausted and hungry. And so when you ask him to do something, he's like not happy about it. So if you understand what happened to him, instead of saying, wow, this is a kid who's a bad kid, you go, wow, this is a kid who's struggling and we need to help him rather than get mad at him and kick him out of class. And so this is the shift, I think, is that the more you get to know somebody, the more you understand them. And I don't know if many of your listeners might have watched Ted Lasso, that TV show, Ted Lasso. That whole thing about be curious and not judgmental, that came from Walt Whitman. It's true. If you knew that famous scene where they're playing darts in the pub, when Ted Lasso makes the point that, listen, you get to know me, then you wouldn't bet with darts with me because you'd know that every Sunday for 5 hours I went and played darts with my dad or whatever it was. That's something that is, I think, is so important for all of us when we're trying to understand other people. Is where did you come from? What led you to this point? What is this? What's underneath the behavior? And then once you see that, then it's a lot easier to be gentle with people and understanding and kind of figure out the ways to interact with them that'll be better.
How do early childhood experiences, both positive and negative, influence who we become as adults?
Well, that one of the great things about our species, about human beings, is that we have this remarkable flexibility. Human beings are very adaptable, and it really has allowed us as a species to adapt to a whole variety of climates and circumstances and survive and thrive in most cases. And the most malleable part of us is our brain. The human brain is very adaptable, and however, as adaptable as it is a dynamic system. And for those of, some of the people listening might know a lot about physics or other aspects of, understanding open dynamic systems. Once you start some of these systems in a given direction, then you go from having lots of potential to having a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less, a little bit less. So the decisions and the directions that are defined by early processes will have disproportionate power in shaping how the system organizes and develops. So, for example, with human beings, if you are lucky enough after birth to have a bunch of caregivers, auntie, grandma, mom, present and able to be nurturing and loving and meet your fundamental needs, there are core systems in your brain that are involved in managing stress and regulation that get the necessary signals to organize in a very flexible and resilient way. And then that serves you well as you get older. So as you get to be 1 year old and you can walk around, you can tolerate, you can go a little bit further and explore a little bit further, which means you'll get more experiences, which means you literally grow more social and cognitive strengths. And it becomes this virtuous cycle that somebody who feels safe and regulated can follow their curiosity to the point where they get a little bit overwhelmed and then they go back to where they're safe. But if you have an an one overwhelmed caregiver and they keep you alive, but they're very distracted and they're trying to take care of lots of other kids, what happens is your stress response systems and your willingness to kind of explore the world is a little bit limited. You want what's safe and familiar. So one of these kids who's kind of got this regulated stress response capability will grow and grow and grow and grow. And the other one will grow, but much slower. And pretty soon at age 3, you'll have a child who's really cognitively ready for school and all kinds of other intellectual cognitive things. And then you'll have one kid who's not quite ready. And this gap can persist, and it does. And if you don't have an educational system that understands that, you end up doing things that continue to keep the child who's undeveloped and a little bit behind. It keeps labeling them as slow, inattentive, impulsive, dysregulated, instead of saying, this is a 5-year-old who kind of has a 3-year-old's development. So why don't we give this child the challenges and the learning opportunities we'd give somebody who was 3 instead of somebody who's 5? And if you do meet somebody where they are developmentally, they can catch up. But if you don't, if you continue to expect somebody to perform at a level that they're not able to, you'll only cause trouble. And again, this is relevant for the corporate environment. If you have somebody who demonstrates competence at one task and then you promote them to a leadership role, but you haven't given them any teaching or training or supervision about how to be a leader, there will be this gap between what you want them to do and what they are capable of doing. And so they'll disappoint you and they'll fall short of expectations and then get hard on themselves and the gap gets bigger and bigger. And then pretty soon they'll either leave or you'll have to get rid of them or, and that of course is a very expensive proposition. Um, anyway, so
Yeah. Very
that's
insightful. Dr. Bruce, can you elaborate on the neurological impact of trauma on a developing brain and why children are particularly sensitive to it?
So the it in the lower parts of our developing brain, there are these really very crucial neural networks that are involved in organizing the higher parts of our brain and in mediating all kinds of functions like forming and maintaining relationships and thinking and moving, all kinds of stuff we do. And when you're born, as everybody knows, a newborn baby can't walk, they can't talk, they can't even regulate sleep. So all of these higher order brain mediated functions are undeveloped. And the systems that are involved in our stress response are also involved in organizing these higher order parts of the brain. So one of the things that happens is you are, if these stress response systems are recruited and asked to deal with overwhelming stress when you're an infant or a toddler, that will result in changes in these systems in their baseline level of activity. They'll be more active and they'll be more reactive. So what happens is rather than getting a normal organizing pattern of stimulation to organize and grow, the brain gets these herky-jerky, overactive, kind of discombobulated signals, and all the higher parts of the brain that are depending upon these signals kind of get abnormal cues. So you can end up with difficulties learning, and you can end up with difficulties forming and maintaining relationships. You can end up with fine motor control problems. You end up with difficulties with the systems that go out into the rest of your body that control your lungs and your heart and your gut. So you have a higher risk for developing GI problems. You have a higher risk for developing cardiovascular problems, a higher risk for developing asthma and all kinds of other physical health issues. So the impact of uh, stress and distress and trauma during development it has the potential to be pretty pervasively destructive on the developing child. And the thing that's very important that we're just beginning to understand as a field is that you can have these experiences when you're 1, 2, 3, and then as you get older, you may not have any problems whatsoever, but you'll still exhibit challenges with attention and regulation and relationships and so forth. And that's very confusing for the adult world because most adults aren't asking what happened to you. They're going, what's wrong with you? Why can't you follow directions? Why don't you act the right way? And so this is why, again, sort of the understanding the developmental part of our own experiences leads to better insights about how we function right now.
What are some common challenges people face when addressing their trauma, and how can they overcome these obstacles?
I think one of the most common issues is not necessarily connecting the dots between what might have happened to you when you're younger and the way you function right now. So let me go back to the example of a child where there was, let's say there's a lot of conflict in the family when they were just 2 and 3, and they don't remember, they don't know anything about it. But it was an environment where mom was overwhelmed and maybe there was some domestic violence or a bad relationship, and all of a sudden dad's gone and now mom is on her own, and there's a lot of tension in that environment. So when you're a 2 and 3 year old, you're absorbing all of that anxiety, that stress, that tension, and you develop this heightened sense of wanting to please the adults because you're worried they're going to disappear, you're worried about them. And so what'll happen is you get to be in the third grade and the fourth grade and you want to be a pleaser and you please the teacher, please the teacher, please the teacher, please it. And then you get to the point where you're in a relationship, decide, oh, now it's time for me to go have a boyfriend, girlfriend. And pretty soon, instead of having this mutually reciprocal ability to have a back and forth where both people's needs are equal, right? You go, oh, let me take care of you. Let me take care of you. I will subsume my needs just to make you happy. Whatever you want, whatever you want, whatever you want. And pretty soon you end up going, wow, this relationship feels terrible. And and you may not even understand that your current difficulties with relationships stem back to the relational chaos you experienced when you were little. And so that's the number one big problem is a lot of people don't connect the dots. And when they're trying to solve their current problem, whether it's at work or in relationships or with anxiety or whatever it is, they're not they're not looking backwards so that they can actually get the insights to come up with good solutions. And I think that's the number one problem is a lot of people are walking around with um, and we all are. Every human being is influenced by what happened when they were younger. Um, and sometimes the influences are really positive. I mean, it might make you very resilient. It might make you capable of tolerating all kinds of stuff and being determined and being a hard worker, all kinds of good things. But they're also, everybody's got these little blind spots and everybody's got these little gaps. And we frequently don't have the opportunity to see these unless somebody who we feel safe with helps point them out and helps us make a plan to kind of fill that gap in. And that happens in a really good, when you have a bunch of good relationships, if you have friends that you really trust, at some point they'll sit you down and they go, hey, dude, like, listen, why are you dating women like that? They just treat you like crap and they take advantage of you. And you might hear it the first time and then the second time and the third time, but because they care for you and they're still there, ultimately you begin to go, wow, there is something about why do I do that? I deserve somebody who's going to treat me nice. So let me see if I can figure out how to change. And that's what happens. If you have family, if you have friends, if you have coworkers who are willing to be present and supportive, then it's a lot easier to grow and heal in healthy ways.
Dr. Bruce, what are some effective strategies or practices for individuals and communities to begin the healing process from trauma?
Well, there's a couple things I think that are really important. One is to recognize that trauma has existed for the entire history of our species. Natural disasters and famine and starvation and early death and violence, it's always existed. And again, one of the great gifts of our species is that we've been able to live in groups that have invented cultural elements that keep us together and keep us really that create environments that are both healing and buffering. They can buffer some of the stressors of everyday life. So the most important thing I think for anybody who wants to heal from a traumatic experience is to stay connected to family, community, and culture. Because embedded in culture and community are relational opportunities. People who are going to be safe and stable for you. And and again, I don't want to act, everybody's got family, families, some people in the family are like, you love them, but they drive you crazy, right? Um, but there's still a quality to that feeling like you belong and that this is your place, these are your people, and sort of hard baked into family and culture are routines and rituals that are very rhythmic, that are very regulating, that are very healing. And so these things are really powerful. And if you look at well, really basically all cultures in one way or another, one of the other things that they incorporate, without necessarily calling it therapy, are various rhythmic practices, whether it's cultural dance, cultural song, routines and rituals. I mean, I've actually had the great pleasure of going to several Sikh weddings, and oh my gosh, they're like a week long, right? But they have meals and they have conversation and they have dance and they have these are very culturally healing experiences. They bring people together, they create the glue of community, and that's what helps people heal. That's what helps people deal with the stressors of life and sometimes the traumas of life. So that's the first thing is that connect with your community and your culture. And then the second thing is think about your own preferences that you've developed that you use when you feel overwhelmed or upset. And it might be sport, right? Some people might, when I really have a bad day at work, I need to go for a long run or ride my bike or go swimming or listen to music or whatever. Some people are not as big, large motor. They might be small. They might go, oh, you know what I need to do? I need to read. I need to play video games. I need to draw. But both of these kind of different categories. One, kind of the large motor pattern repetitive rhythmic thing. We know that reaches these lower parts of the brain that are involved in the stress response and it helps them regulate. And these other activities, playing video games, reading a book, watching a movie, they help us go to a different lower part of the brain and get regulated by what we call dissociation. So you just kind of like you lose all of the worries of the day and all the tensions of the day while you're, you know, playing a video game. Now, obviously, please don't play the video game for hours and hours and hours and hours. But just jumping on a computer, some people you play for 45 minutes and then that's like a dose of kind of regulation. So there, look at what you use to regulate and then think about ways to take that and dose it throughout the day. That will be very, very helpful. So if you really get regulated by going for a long walk in nature and you do 45-minute walk after work, whatever, figure out some way to go get up every hour and walk for 3 minutes. And it may not, obviously it's not a hike, but if you go out into the corporate environment where there might be like a little fountain and whatever, or if there's not, just go somewhere, just go walk on the street. Um, you'd be surprised. And if you walk every hour for 5 minutes, you can get a lot of miles. You can get a couple miles in a day. So but when you do that, what you'll find is, and this is the great thing about the body, is that you don't need 45 minutes to get regulated. You only need about 3 to 5 minutes to kind of get back to a reasonable state of regulation. And so if you learn how to dose those things that you like, it's very helpful for you. And it again, figure out how to spread that out through the day so that you can stay in a somewhat even keel as you're managing all the stressors of the day.
Dr. Perry, how did the combination of storytelling and scientific insight in what happened to you enhance the accessibility and impact of the book's message?
That's a really good question, Deepak. When there's a couple of things that it was very intentional. And one of the reasons I wrote it that way, and I talked with Oprah a lot about this and the people that were involved in this, is that I really felt that the topic area can be very emotionally charged. And um, if you go in and talk about something that's really overwhelming for too long, a lot of people just go, "Oh my God, this is just too much," and they just cannot stay there. And it's the same thing with the scientific stuff. Like if you make people kind of think too much about, all right, this is the brain, and that's part of it with language they've never heard before, and it's like, oh my God, my brain aches. I can't even stand this. So the goal is to give tiny little doses of the content So to be a little bit challenging and then to let people kind of get back into something that feels more comfortable. And so we tried to build a rhythm into it to go back and forth between kind of difficult science and then easy storytelling and then emotional stuff and then back into kind of boring science and then it, so is there's a little bit of a rhythm that we tried to build into it, and that was very intentional. I've read a number of books, and I get asked to review books all the time. And one of the big, I don't want to say mistakes, but it's just it is not pleasurable to read about somebody getting abused for like seriously like 80 pages in a row. I mean, I'm in this field and I can't stand this. So you need to help the rhythm in sort of dipping into the emotionally intense stuff and then getting a little bit of relief is very important. And I think that's important in any good novel. You know, if you look at one of the best novels written in the United States, All the King's Men, it's beautiful, it's lyrical, there's a rhythm to the prose, and it's written by a poet. He only wrote one novel, and he was the poet laureate of the United States, but he wrote one novel, and it's beautiful like that. And when you find a novel that you enjoy reading and you go back and look at it, you'll see that there's a rhythm to it, right? There's a even in the way the words are constructed and the way the topics are handled, and then you back off and you kind of go in and you go back off. And I think that good film does the same thing. Good storytelling is rhythmic. So that's kind of what we tried to build into the book.
Dr. Bruce, generally people say get along with positive people. So in that case, what happens when somebody talk negatively about, or make a negative comments and how it affects our brain?
Yeah, you know, there's a bunch of really excellent research about um, the the importance of positive thinking. And there's a bunch of really interesting emerging work about the negative impact of negative thinking, which kind of makes sense. But turns out that when you have a negative thought about yourself, like, oh, I'm dumb, I can't do this, whatever, that has, for some reason, it has much more power than you saying to yourself, you know, I can do this, I'm smart, I'm whatever. So you need about like three, four, five, six times as many positive thoughts and positive things to kind of counterbalance one negative thought. For whatever reason, and I have some ideas about why this might be, but the human brain it sort of latches on to negative a lot more than it latches on to positive. Part of that might be related to the brain's primary role to keep us alive. So cues that go, oh, there's fruit, there's good food to eat, there's good food to eat, there's a saber-toothed tiger, you know, that's much more important information than the fact that there's fruit on that bush over there. So it's important that our brain hones in on potentially threatening cues. That, but if you're not aware of that, then as a leader, for example, in a corporate environment, what you learn is if you say one even neutral thing to somebody, that can have really powerful impact on their performance. If somebody is made to feel valued and they think, oh, he thinks I'm doing a good job, I'm going to work harder for him, you'll get more output by somebody saying a positive thing than by you pointing out that you're not doing this quite right. And it's the challenge is though is that as a parent, I don't know if you're a parent, but when you're a parent and you start to analyze the conversations and the content, what we say way more negative things to our kids, sort of like editing, commenting, improving, get better at this, why didn't that? Then we do saying that was great. I'm happy that you did that. You should be proud of yourself that that was hard work. We have to learn how to discipline our language so that we are contributing to the positive input that people get so that they create internally in their own head a positive image of themselves, which will in the long run be better for their performance, better for their willingness to kind of explore the world. If you feel like you're stupid and you're not any good, what it does is it crushes curiosity and willingness to go out and expose yourself. But if you don't go out and try something new, you don't expose yourself, guess what? You don't learn anything. And so being a constructive criticizer, we use that term, usually is inhibiting as opposed to really helping somebody grow. But that's an art to leadership, right? That's one of the arts, one of the really challenging things about being a good supervisor and mentor is how do you walk side by side with somebody and make a suggestion that doesn't feel like a criticism, but it still helps them grow. And so that form of reflective supervision is a really important skill to learn if you're in the corporate world, if you're a coach, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, and it speaks to your point, Deepak, about the way your brain processes negative versus positive content.
Dr. Bruce, my last question. What are the future directions in trauma research that excite you the most, and how do you see them influencing mental health practices?
I'm glad you asked that because we're changing the way we do our work. And it really goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the power of community and culture. It turns out, and this is from our work, we've done some work with really large scale natural disasters and man-made disasters, where the number of people impacted is so great. We're talking about millions of people impacted by trauma that the current mental health model of coming into my office and I'll give you the 45 minutes, 50 minutes of evidence-based practice, whatever it is, and you'll get better. That's impossible that will never work with large scale, natural disasters, and it will never work with like in Gaza. It'll just never work. You can't train enough people to do conventional mental health work to help heal that kind of trauma. Now, what I said earlier is that we know that trauma's existed forever. But we also know that many cultural practices and cultural elements evolved to deal with the dysregulation that comes with traumatic loss, with traumatic death, with sickness, with all of the things that in everyday life are distressing and stressful and traumatic. And that these culturally embedded practices are actually very effective, if not more effective, than our best evidence-based practice. So what we've been doing is, and I think the whole future of mental health service delivery is this, it's getting out of the medical model and getting into communities and building capacity in communities, encouraging cultural practices that are healthy, that are regulating, that are connecting, that make people feel like they belong, make people feel valued, make people feel seen, and allow the natural healing practices of family, community, and culture to work. Now, right now, the inertia of the Western world is to blow up family, community, and culture, right? We have mobility and transportation. So there's extended family is a thing of the past, really. There are some communities where, you have brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, grandmas, all in the same community. And you know what? When you have a newborn baby in that environment, you distribute caregiving burden, right? You get all kinds of people that can help you with the challenges. And if somebody loses a job, they get taken care of. But if you're living all by yourself in Butte, Montana, and the rest of your family is living off in New York City, and something happens, who helps you? You'll be lucky if you might get a neighbor a little bit, help a little bit. If you're part of a community of faith, maybe they'll help a little bit, but it's not the same as being really embedded in community and culture and family. And that's the future, I think, of a healthy society is recapturing some of the strength that was present in a kind of the more natural living environment of multi-generational, multi-family groups. And that's where I think the future of mental health is. is recognizing the power of connectedness, the power of relationships, the importance of being present, attentive, attuned, and responsive to the people around us, and figuring out how, in all of that, we can weave in new technologies in ways that are not disrupting, but are ways that are unifying. And I think it can happen. But, honestly, the corporate world is going to be a leader in this. They're going to help us figure out how to do this in better ways. And I think that there are people thinking about it right now.
Listeners, thank you for all for joining us today for this insightful conversation with Dr. Bruce D. Perry. We are incredibly honored to have him here, sharing his extensive knowledge and groundbreaking work in the field of children's mental and neuroscience. Dr. Perry's lifelong commitment to understanding and addressing the impact of trauma, abuse, and neglect on the developing brain has not only shaped clinical practices and policies, but has also profoundly touched lives worldwide. His contributions from the creation of the neurosequential model to his collaborations with prominent figures like Oprah Winfrey have made an indelible mark on how we approach trauma, resilience, and healing. We're deeply grateful to Dr. Perry for his time today and for the invaluable work he continues to do in advancing our understanding of the neurodevelopment effects of trauma and the pathway to healing. Thank you once again, Dr. Perry, for your generosity in sharing your wisdom, and thank you to our audience for being a part of this enriching conversation. Thank you, Dr. Perry.
Thank you, Deepak. It was great talking with you.
Yeah, thank you.